All right, so when we stick weld, we're going to talk about our very first assignment, which is just running a pad of beads, often called a surface weld. And unlike TIG welding, there's a lot more going on outside of your welding helmet than in TIG welding. There's a lot of fumes, there's a lot of sparks, a lot of spatter, kind of more aggressive, almost like if you were to TIG weld without your gas. That might be what you're going to experience, but amplified. We want to make sure that we are properly covered up. You might have gotten away with TIG welding in your shorts. I know it was hotter outside, now it's getting colder. Maybe this won't be a big deal, but you want to make sure you're covered up. Long sleeves, long pants, put your welding cap on. Nothing worse than getting a spark right in the middle of your head while you're trying to lay a weld and you get distracted. We also are going to switch over to our working Mig gloves or stick gloves. These are the long gauntlet gloves that you got. Make sure you put those on all the way. Again, you want to make sure that you're electrode positive on your machine, that it's on the stick welding process, and the output is on. You also want to make sure that your work clamp is on the table and that you have your stinger or your electrode holder ready to go. We're going to drape that on that side. For this assignment, we are going to use 7018. I'm going to leave on this welder right here. I'll start with one electrode. You're also going to need a chipping hammer and a brush at some point during this process. You do not want to weld over the slag, and I'm going to show you after our first bead what that slag looks like, how we get rid of it, and then how we continue on with this assignment. But rule number one, do not weld over slag. When we do this assignment, about 110 to 115 is going to be plenty for what we're going to be doing and how we're going to do it. In this stinger holder, there are several grooves. There's a groove at the top, there's a groove at the bottom, and then there's an X groove, one that faces down, one that faces up. So you can hold this electrode in whichever way is comfortable. I often will go with the bottom straight out. I oftentimes will wrap the lead once around the outside of my arm just to kind of take the cable off of my wrist and more onto my elbow. In order to get a good position on this, we can't weld lazy. We can't have our hand down at our hip. We're going to have to maintain a higher angle. So we are going to keep that elbow pointing up in the air, and we're going to then continually push down and feed. But again, striking the arc is probably one of the most difficult things we're going to do in this process, and it's either a tap and scratch like that or a swooping scratch. There is a little bit of flux that covers the bare end of this electrode, and you want to make sure that you need to touch that bare electrode to the metal. But if you just touch it like that, it will fuse automatically to the plate. So we want to be able to, as quickly as possible, touch and scratch. Stay in motion. The moment you stop, it will want to fuse, especially if you start it to spark. So we want to stay in motion, scratch that plate. Once it starts to spark, we want to slightly lift off the table. We want to hover just ever so lightly, go back to the beginning where we want to start our weld, and then go into that trick where we just push straight down at that angle. All right? Now, sticking the electrode, getting it fused to the plate, don't worry about it. It's going to be frustrating. Just accept that it's going to happen. But get over it. We got to keep trying. That is, again, one of the more difficult parts in stick welding is to strike the arc. So now that I've gone over that, I'm going to get myself in a position. Again, you want to make sure that you can do this without getting caught up on another piece of metal or another object. Make sure your arms can move freely. I'm going to slightly brace my elbow on the table, just like that, and then I can slide it down as I weld in. Again, you don't want to try and do this freehand or without bracing yourself up on something. Maybe lean against the wall in your booth, prop yourself up, get stable. All right, we're going to drop our hoods, strike your arc, cover. So I'm going to try and maintain a nice tight arc. If it sticks or goes out momentarily, you try and pull back a little bit and get the relight and just continue on. If it sticks and fuses to the plate, you'll need to stop, unclamp the electrode, and then break off the electrode. Be careful, the electrode will be hot after you fuse it to the plate. Alright, so we can see that I started in about the same spot. I might have shifted over a little bit, but all I did was come down. A couple spots at the beginning, I stuck just a little bit, but I slightly bobbed out and then came back nice and close to kind of reignite the arc. If you stick it and you are paused, it will fuse to the plate, and you will need to unclamp the electrode and then grab it and bend it off. If it's really hot, then go quench it and then bend it off. This is where our chipping hammer and our brush come into play. We're going to take this and just slightly tap on the edge of the weld until it breaks off. We don't need to go crazy on this. And then we'll take our brush, make sure all the other slag is off, and then there we have it. We have a nice weld. You can see where I stuck just briefly at the very beginning, and then I bobbed it out and touched it back in and kind of got it reignited and then kept going. All right, now what I just chipped off is called slag. And when there's a slag welding process, if there's a weld that produces slag, you want to make sure you have a drag angle. We are not going to push this. We are not going to push this on this position ever. We are always going to have the electrode pointing back to where we struck the arc and kind of have that arc pushing the slag coating backwards. All right, so what I'm going to do now is I want to basically run another bead, but I'm going to place and I'm going to try and trace the very edge, or what's called the toe of the weld, and I'm trying to watch the puddle come up about halfway onto that first bead, and I'm just going to make two lines that overlapping, kind of like dominoes that have been knocked over. That's your first domino. We're putting the second domino down, and it's going to be somewhat overlapped. So I'm going to move my chipping hammer and my brush out of the way. This is very much a repetitive process, but that's the idea. There is an industry application for this type of weld, but it's very much repetition and just getting used to welding and doing it often and frequent and get going on it. So here we go, wrap it around my arm again just to get stable, and we're going to cover. And again, I'm going to try and point that electrode right on the edge of that first weld. Maybe not quite centered on the edge, but at least the side of the electrode is touching the edge of that first weld. And the key here is every movement that I do is going to be a movement in the puddle. So if I can keep this as steady of an operation as possible, then my beads will look as consistent as they can. You'll notice that we didn't use as much electrode on this pass, and that's because we're not quite putting down as much metal, because we're filling in next to a bead, not a bead by itself. All right, we can still use this though for shorter beads or tacking, so it's not garbage until we hit to the numbers. Take our chipping hammer, rake that off, move that out of the way. Now, at the end of the period, you're going to have a lot more to clean up also with this welding process. You're going to need to grind your tables more frequently and sweep out your booths every day. Get my brush, brush that off, grab another electrode.